Welcome to NightCAP. It's November 9th.
Time for your weekly dose of commentary, analysis, and politics.
I'm Fallon Gallagher.
And I'm James Duran.
And tonight we're joined by Pauline Essman and Graham Ferguson. Last Sunday, the state of Texas experienced its worst mass shooting when a gunman opened fire on First Baptist Church of Sutherland Springs, killing 26 and injuring 20 more. So here's what we know so far. The suspect, Devin Patrick Kelly, opened fire with an assault-type rifle that he had no business of owning. We'll come back to that later. Then, two legally gun-owning Texans pursued the gunman until he was driven off the road. Kelly died from what appeared to be self-inflicted gunshot wounds. So we have this crazy dichotomy here. The shooting killed more than 24 people, but the gunman was eventually stopped as a result of gun-carrying citizens.
Yeah, so a couple takeaways here. I think, first of all, an incredible tragedy in a place of worship. Certainly not something that anyone expected to deal with when they went to church. Two, I think, in addition to law enforcement, as you mentioned, Fallon, we have two legally armed citizens who, in addition to that self-inflicted wound, also caused gunshot wounds to Kelly, and actually caused him to flee the scene, possibly making it, a lot less catastrophic than it could have been, forcing him to leave the scene of the church. And I think, third, not saying we shouldn't talk about gun control, but of course, as you mentioned, these were actually gun laws that we already have in place that were not properly implemented that could have prevented this. And I think finally, just making sure that we try not to project our views on this issue onto each specific situation is always important. So, Pauline, with all that said, your reaction to all this, is this in part a triumph of legal gun ownership?
I would have to say it's not a triumph of legal gun ownership, and I think primarily, like you mentioned, this is a situation where the laws were failed to be implemented properly, and in particular, the FBI had information that did not get to the people that it needed to, and so the gun was obtained, and a lot of violence happened before it was stopped by people who were legally carrying those guns.
But I want to speak, we were talking about the legality of guns here. I don't want to forget that this massacre would not have happened if the existing gun control laws were properly followed, like we mentioned earlier. So, Pauline, coming back to you, do you think that we should shift our attention to new gun control laws when we can't enforce the ones that we already have?
I think that we have to kind of take these situations case by case, and in this particular instance, I do think that we need to be making sure that current gun laws are getting addressed, but looking at why they're not being implemented the way they should be. And if it's that they're too difficult to be implemented or that there's some sort of disconnect, then we need to work on creating new gun laws that are easier to implement where things aren't falling through the cracks.
Yeah, Graham, we hear a lot about common sense gun laws. That's a phrase that's popular, particularly with Democrats. How should we be defining that? I would agree as someone who's pro-guns that there are common sense reforms, but the problem is we all disagree on what that means. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the interesting things to look at with this is that in Texas there's a law where you need a license to carry a gun, but you don't need a license to purchase a gun. That doesn't seem like common sense. I don't see where that really matches up. I also think this is absolutely a gun issue. I know the president has talked about how this involves mental illness. I absolutely think that it's a twofold issue. But I think what's disappointing is that he's not really taking as much of a stance. I wouldn't expect him to take a stance against guns. That's just something that I wouldn't expect him to do. But I do think that needs to be addressed, and by declaring this is solely an issue of mental illness, he's ignoring a problem that's glaring right at him in the face.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. You saw the really quick reaction, in New York, for example, with the terrorist attack. You see this when, essentially when it plays into his narrative, you see him react quickly. But, we can figure that out as we go, like you said, case by case.
Right.
So now I want to shift. You mentioned New York, but I want to go back to Vegas. Vegas was 1 month ago, and that was the deadliest mass shooting in the United States that we have ever seen. Just last week, we had a terror attack in Tribeca. It wasn't necessarily a gun attack, but it was still an attack, and we lost lives there. But that was about a week ago, and we're already not talking about that anymore. We've moved on. After Vegas, we saw some discussion of bans on bump stocks coming from senators like Dianne Feinstein of California, but nothing. We've seen nothing actually come to fruition here. So I'm just curious for both of your thoughts on this one, but have we become so numb to these types of attacks? What can we realistically do to break this pattern before we're discussing shootings every day on the evening news and have absolutely no reaction to it?
Yeah, I think something interesting about this whole situation, my sister, she goes to school in New York City, and so she actually was near where the events transpired on that day. Obviously, she was okay, but I think, I mean, at least talking to her, like her reaction was that, you know, it seems like this is just a normal thing, and like, oh, thank God, only like, you know, not as many people were killed, and we had 58 killed in Las Vegas. You know, I just think it's ridiculous that this stuff is just becoming so normal. And like I said, I just hope that we can somehow, you know, have somebody that'll make a change.
Well, you mentioned earlier that you are actually a journalism student. Do you think, what role do you think that the 24-hour news cycle and the role of the mainstream media, cable news, I mentioned nightly news, what role do you think that's playing in our society's, I guess, sort of numbness to this?
No, I think it absolutely is numbing. I mean, when you're hearing this stuff 24/7, I mean, you're just getting inundated with this stuff, and we're having, you know, shootings. It seems like left and right. I mean, you're wondering when's the next one. I mean, when's somebody that I'm close with going to be involved or hurt by an incident like that? And so I think, you know, like you said, I definitely agree. I think the 24-hour, you know, news cycle definitely adds to this sense of numbness. So,
yeah, I mean, Pauline, so in part, you know, I think it's important, you know, we saw with New York, for example, reports that folks were just going about their business immediately after. I think that's important. That's one of the reasons, one of the things that makes this country great. We're able to bounce back. We're able to get on with our lives and not be, you know, sort of living in fear of terrorism. But is there a mix there between that? What I'm getting to here, is there a mix between, you know, going about our lives, but also being able to have the discussions we need to have, whether it's guns, whether it's you know, immigration, you know, what is there a mix there that we're not quite hitting?
Absolutely. I think that we definitely as citizens need to be much more informed and also compassionate on a day-to-day basis with these kinds of issues. And I think that we are seeing people really struggling to move on with their lives and kind of becoming more numb to these issues because of just how difficult they are. And I think that we need to balance that with kind of a support and compassion for understanding why people are maybe growing numb to these issues, but at the same time preparing, even at like a young level, students in particular for these kinds of difficult discussions. It seems like people are going to be having more and more in their day-to-day lives.
Do you think that we're going to become so numb that we just never act? I mean, we mentioned we didn't talk about New York after a couple days. We didn't take any sort of a follow-up action. Do you think that that's going to become a problem?
It's difficult to say because the action is obviously happening at the level of politicians, but they do pay attention to what their constituents are saying. And if there's less pressure from their constituents to act, then it might be that we're moving to a world where these things aren't getting addressed. But at the same time, because these are kind of issues that hit close to home, I do think that we're still going to see some action because there are people who are affected very personally by these issues, and therefore there's going to be pressure at some level to act.
I mean, I do have one thing to add. I feel like
final thoughts on
yeah,
this?
I do think like there are two common denominators here. I think mental illness is, I mean, absolutely part of all this, but also like obviously like you can't not admit that there are guns involved. And we have, quite frankly, a president in office who doesn't want to admit that. He's made that very clear. There's also, you know, a large, you know, majority of Americans, well, not majority of Americans, but a large faction of Americans that, you know, don't want to see any sort of gun legislation. And so I think personally, until we, you know, can come to some sort of unified consensus, we're not going to get anywhere.
All right, well, hold those thoughts. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to take a hop across the pond. Stick with us.
Timing-wise.
At Northwestern,
Right on time.
we're Wildcats in every
Good job,
way.
guys.
Northwestern break right through that. With our colors flying, we will cheer you all to go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
Welcome back. President Trump is currently on a 12-day trip to Asia. He's stopping in China, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, and the Philippines. So far, we've seen him act chummy with President Xi Jinping of China, address North Korea's nuclear program, basically to North Korea, though he was in South Korea, and naturally plug his New Jersey golf course.
Yeah, so I think a logical question here, I mean, besides that plugging of the golf course, is this the same Trump we saw on the campaign trail? I mean, I think by all accounts, this has been a successful trip so far in terms of acting presidential. I mean, we've seen very few hiccups. We've seen him sort of stay on message using key phrases, such as in China saying that we're calling for an open and free Indo-Pacific, being careful about China's more aggressive attempts to create a sphere of influence, things of that nature. Of course, one hiccup that we discussed was, of course, the kind of rookie White House mistake of allowing the Chinese to dictate that there would be no press questions. Hopefully they'll work out those kinks, and hopefully that wasn't intentional. But China was always the part of the trip to watch, and President Xi and President Trump, very differing stature at the moment, different popularity at home, to be sure. And so that recent elevation of President Xi to equal standing as essentially the country's founder, Mao Zedong, if I'm saying that right, comparing that with Trump standing at home, I think, is really important. And as we're seeing Trump leave China this evening or tomorrow morning, what implications does that have, their relative standing at home, their relative support at home? What implications does that have on leverage? So, taking all this into account, Graham, does President Trump find himself in a position of weakness as he tries to negotiate with China, for example, on North Korea to try and get them on board?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's any secret that Trump's in a hole right now. I mean, his approval ratings are in the low to mid 30s at best right now, and so he's definitely going to try to come home with something to talk about, something to write home about. But I think what we're going to see in China is, you're going to see Mr. Xi absolutely roll out the red carpet for him. I think what's been interesting too is how Trump has had this sort of America first, I guess logic mantra, whatever you want to call it. It'd be interesting, and as of recently too, he's kind of been talking more highly about Mr. Xi, about China, than he has since being elected, or even on the campaign
Which
trail.
is way different from what we saw on the campaign trail when it was China, China, and took that hardline stance on China. I mean, you would agree that we're seeing a totally different Trump here.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of me likes to think maybe he's getting a little ego check here, maybe but then again, I don't know. We'll see.
Also seemed to be stoking his ego with the red carpet.
Yeah, right.
He loves a good party.
Yeah, that's definitely true. So I think the other thing we're seeing here, as we kind of hinted at, this sphere of influence question, and whether China can take advantage of recent installations. They're building military installations in the South China Sea, contested waters even. And so, as I mentioned, President Trump is being careful in his language about that. But, is this an opportunity that China is seeing? And if this is a deal we're making, the art of the deal and so on and so forth, if we are trying to make a deal, Pauline, whereby we allow China to sort of expand in stature and presence in exchange for some assistance with North Korea, we've seen them sign on to those recent UN sanctions. Is that a deal that's a good deal for us?
Well, I definitely think that we need to kind of assess what's best right now, and it might be that it's a deal worth taking. Whether it's a deal that benefits China over the U.S. is a little unclear right now, in particular with the South China Sea. That's been a dilemma that's been talked about for years, and so with island building going on in the South China Sea in particular. And so I think that we're not giving China too much leverage here, and in fact, seeing Trump pivot from kind of this isolationist stance to a more engaged foreign policy might be a turnaround of events that improves U.S. standing in the international arena.
Yeah, Graham, your thoughts on this? This is, I think, the longest presidential trip since H.W. Bush. Clearly there's a lot of intentional calculation going on here.
Yeah, well, I feel like a lot of it has to do with North Korea. If North Korea was an issue right now, I don't feel like we'd be seeing Trump putting this much emphasis on China. Clearly there's some sort of, they need to come to some sort of agreement about what to do. Obviously I think Trump's probably going to be pushing on China to put sanctions on North Korea. I doubt that's going to happen. But on the flip side of things, we'll see what China has to offer Trump while he's out there.
Yeah, and I think moving on a little bit, there's another element here that I think the Trump administration has come under some flack for, Pauline. I think the human rights abuses, right? That has been something that has been a hallmark of when American presidents talk about China, when American presidents sort of, create relationships with China. They're careful to mention those things, to condemn certain things when they overstep. This is a one-party country. It's a communist country in which there's no other option, right? Is that something that that we're not seeing enough of from the Trump administration in terms of across the board not recognizing human rights violations?
I definitely think we need to be seeing more of it, and it needs to be absolutely consistent, because historically, I think where the U.S. has lost standing or where it's been criticized for its hypocrisy, it has been when we've tolerated those kinds of human rights abuses to make alliances or to forge deals with countries, and it's definitely come back to bite us. and it means that domestically we look less credible. And so I do think that that needs to be a continuous thing that's occurring from the
Well, and just going off of that too, I'm curious about your thoughts. Just this last week in an interview, I think it was with Fox, General Kelly, Trump's chief of staff, said, quote, the system of government that has apparently worked for the Chinese people with regards to human rights. What do you think about that kind of statement coming from the West Wing?
I think it's a little strange to hear that statement, for sure, and I think that we've had kind of mixed statements about the government that has been in place in China, and it's interesting to hear these kinds of statements in a context where the Chinese government is shifting and we're seeing greater openness and more trade in kind of this political transition period, and so understanding it in that context is really interesting.
Well, great. So we briefly mentioned North Korea. Now we want to dig into that a little bit more. So before we shift, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page with what's exactly been going on here in the last few months with Trump and his friend, who he likes to call the Rocket Man. So we've seen relatively little activity since those missile tests that we were seeing pretty frequently over the summer, which were followed by subsequent UN sanctions that were supported by both China and Russia, which is noteworthy. But, you know, Trump did criticize Prime Minister Abe of Japan for not shooting down those missiles.
Yeah, so I think history is important here. I mean, 8 years of cautious diplomatic language has only gotten us to the point of absolute nuclear brinkmanship. So I think it's tough to criticize already. We haven't seen whether this differing approach works, but Pauline and Graham, I want to get your thoughts on this. This approach of more direct language, more direct approach to North Korea, kind of calling it how he sees it. Fallon mentioned Rocket Man, but I think there's also more significant things that the U.S. government's doing. Are there any signs that this is working better so far?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's seeing Trump do this. It's almost like he's playing the game of Kim Jong-un. I mean, it's like I know that's Trump is this guy's got this is how he does things. But I feel like the consequences, the stakes are much higher for Trump. I mean, he's got the American people. He's got 300, almost 30 million people to get approval because he wants to get reelected, obviously. And whereas the North Korean leader doesn't have to deal with that. And so basically, whatever he says, he doesn't have to deal with the consequences of it. And so I think so far you've seen Trump kind of stoop down to that level, and he's paid the price for it. And it hasn't really quite worked out the same way that it did, for example, on the campaign trail.
Yeah, and I mean, I think in addition to the folks at home, he also has folks in South Korea to worry about. I mean, that is a potentially easy thing for North Korea to do that would have dramatic consequences. I mean, Pauline, is there also a case to be made, though, that this is sort of the language that someone like Kim Jong-un understands, the way that Trump is talking?
I could see that could be made the case. What I do worry about, though, is how it does reflect to other countries in the international community, in particular where there are these diplomatic norms about the kind of language that you use and what it implies, and suddenly for there to be another source of unpredictability that maybe North Korea understands, but for there to be just another source of chaos and unpredictability in the international arena and predicting what this kind of language means, I think it's dangerous, and I think that it's worrisome, or at least strange and concerning, that some of the diplomacy that's happening right now from the United States is happening over Twitter and happening with this kind of tweeting language.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
I mean, he had that, I just want to add that good tweet about the wall.
Yeah.
So
Trump likes what he sees in terms of walls over there. So
I don't know if you guys saw, but Trump tweeted just right before we went on the air that he's leaving to move on to the next leg of his trip, but FLOTUS Melania is staying to see the zoo and China's Great Wall in all caps. Fun little tidbit.
They do have a great wall. So I think as we, just to kind of button this up, one other thing that I think he's rightly taking some criticism for, in Japan, mentioning that essentially Prime Minister Abe needs to buy American weapon systems in order to keep their country safe. I mean, that is sort of a bizarre signal to be sending. I mean, are we trying to send the signal that collective defense is conditional on weapons deals? I hope not. But with that, the Olympics being less than 100 days away, certainly some Medill reporters going there as well. We really need a strategy. And I think just to wrap this up, sanctions haven't worked yet. And the number of times I've heard these are the strongest sanctions ever, I can't even count. 2, I think the military has said that controlling nukes would require a ground invasion. So, as Graham, you touched on, the stakes here could not be higher. And 3, that the missile defense tests really haven't met the standard that we should require. Pauline, you and I debated missile defense systems back in high school. and somehow we still haven't actually figured out how to implement them, which I think is shocking, and we should all be a little bit concerned about the West Coast in particular. So with that, if you like the conversation, follow along on social media. We've got a few handles up here for you. And also, if you would like to come on the show
If
and
you
really
like the conversation, you can shoot us a message. We'd love to have you. More NightCAP after the break.
At Northwestern, we're Wildcats in every way.
Go you Northwestern. Go Northwestern, break right through that. With our colors flying, we will cheer you all to go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
Welcome back. 1 year ago today, November 9th, Donald Trump was officially elected the 45th President of the United States. It's been a full year, yet we're still discussing what happened in 2016 and how it has affected the political landscape. Since this week alone, we've seen the first statewide elections in Virginia and also in New Jersey, which we talked about last week. But in both of those states, we've seen a demonstration of a rejection of Trumpism. Meanwhile, we're seeing the cracks in the Democratic Party really come to light, those cracks that were left by the Clinton campaign.
Yeah, so I think, when we think about this election, we should qualify this. Of course, less than 100,000 votes in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania combined decided this election. So I don't want to, read too much into this, but I think particularly with the Donna Brazile revelations, this continues to just be a story of gross incompetence by the Clinton campaign. You talk about not going to Wisconsin after the convention, spending money in places like Arizona and Nebraska won instead of pouring money into Michigan, and frankly, no positive message, right? No economic message. An interesting stat I saw from a public opinion strategies report, 20% of people estimated based on exit polling, 20% of people who voted for Obama at least once voted for Trump. And so, there was sort of a complete air of arrogance and entitlement that we've still seen permeate. And I think, the things that I've just outlined are things that, frankly, some people still aren't willing to hear. And feel free to challenge me on any of those if you want to take up the conversation. But
on social media,
we should also agree that we can also agree that I think the Trump campaign did a few things right. You mentioned digital, you mentioned Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania all being on the schedule, and having a message. Make America great again. How many people really didn't know what his message was? So now, with this new book by Donna Brazile, Fallon, we're seeing some
more hacking everywhere. She did a preview of it in Politico magazine this week, but like you said, Donna Brazile is exposing the problems that were plaguing both the Clinton campaign and the DNC behind the scenes, and that's just out this week. So, Pauline, it seems like Donna Brazile has been pressured by the so-called Clinton administration. What Clinton administration? I don't really know, but the Clinton administration, and others to stop using the phrase rigged. What are your thoughts on this? Do you think that Democrats are still unable to acknowledge what actually happened in 2016?
I think that there's a lot of tension and fracturing within the Democratic Party, and I think one wing is definitely struggling to understand these criticisms of the establishment and how there is a part of the Democratic Party that certainly a lot of the population thinks is rigging elections or is part of this group of people that has lost touch with American people. And I think that is something that really the Democratic Party needs to come to terms with. And not only do they need to find a positive message, but they really need to reconcile the two wings that we're seeing with the split between the Sanders groups as well as the Clinton supporters.
Yeah, and Graham, new poll out this week from CNN showing that the favorability of the Democratic Party is at a new low nationwide. Is this a reminder that when we get away from the coast, the Democratic Party is still toxic, that there are really countless congressional districts that they're going to have to win where, Nancy Pelosi is less popular than Donald Trump, for example.
Right. I think, obviously, I think both parties are in shambles right now. There's no secret about that. I think, in an ideal world, I'd love to see, due to the fractures, it'd be awesome if we could get like a third party to come to life or some sort of, one can only hope.
Why don't you start it?
Hey, who knows?
Graham and I will be the ticket.
But yeah, I do think.
I'm not voting for that one.
Okay. I do think that this, the fact that both parties, approval ratings are so low right now just says so much about, people even wanting to get involved in politics. They think the whole thing's a disaster. And so, I feel like the long-term consequences of this, obviously, there are plenty of short-term, but I think the long-term, we're going to see less people that are, inclined to wanting to get involved because. Yeah.
I do have to jump in there, though, because Democratic turnout was pretty high. We saw recently in these elections that just happened in New Jersey and Virginia.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. Well, just to get to that.
Yeah, jumping to Virginia, last week we talked about it a lot with our roundtable, and we had them predict. They were right. Ralph Northam won the race by 9 points, which is bigger than I think either of us actually predicted. He blew out Ed Gillespie in Northern Virginia and competed pretty well in Central and Richmond areas. The Democrats also appear to have erased a 32-seat Republican majority pending some recounts.
Yeah, that's in the House of Delegates. So I think, a few things are evident from that graphic. Is this a rejection of Trump? It looks like it. Is this a rejection of Gillespie's Trumpian message in the final weeks? I think absolutely. An op-ed by Kristen Soltis Anderson sort of hits that note. A candidate acting like Trump performed like Trump in Virginia. And so, there's a few takes in the immediate aftermath. This election was only 2 days ago, but the DGA has some polling that shows that Gillespie's Fave on Fave took quite a hit after the MS-13 ad went up, so kind of a suggestion that Trumpian message, that Trumpian tone was rejected. But overall, I think it's important to note that Ed Gillespie made a decision to lose moderates in exchange for trying to turn out the base that almost beat him in the primary. Ed won in places like Loudoun County in his Senate race just 3 years ago. On Tuesday, did no better than Trump in some of those areas. So, Trump also didn't really help him out. He stepped all over his message, forced Gillespie's hand a little bit on these statues. But when you start framing yourself as the pro-Confederate statue candidate, all of a sudden, I think voting becomes an imperative for a lot more people in a state like Virginia, folks that maybe would have stayed home in 2014 when Ed Gillespie was the real Ed Gillespie. So that said, Mark Warner, again, beat him by less than a percentage point in 2014, just to button that up. But turnout was really incredible. Pauline just touched on that. Gillespie actually won more votes than any Republican statewide nominee in Virginia history, and as Fallon mentioned, lost by 8 to 9. So, a lot to parse through here. I think that Latino Victory Fund, unfortunately, was probably a factor in that blowout. Not seen on TV by a lot of people, but the intended effect to get people talking absolutely succeeded. So, Gillespie always had serious flaws as a candidate, Fallon. We were talking about this, irrespective of Trump. He's a consummate Washington insider, former Bush White House RNC chairman, and a pretty extensive lobbying career. And you had conservative group like Judicial Watch actually saying that Gillespie's ties to corporations may pose a conflict of interest to him and that it's, quote, a nonpartisan concern. So I don't want to read too much into this.
You're reading into a lot of things and you like to talk a lot on this show.
Well, no, I'm actually
We're
saying
out of time on
we
this
should
segment.
not read into it too much. So I just want to get that down.
Okay, well,
certainly a wake-up call.
We're out
for
of time on
Republicans,
Virginia. You're done with Virginia. What did you guys miss this week? Our roundtable is going to let you know what, in case you missed it. So, Pauline, what do you have for us?
Absolutely. So, NASA recently just finished one of its Juno spacecraft rounds, and they released a bunch of new pictures of Jupiter that are just groundbreaking and beautiful, and I'd highly encourage you all to see them because there's a lot of new discoveries that are going on with kind of the surface of Jupiter as well as the kind of chemical balance and makeup of it right now.
Graham, what do you got for us?
Yes, this is probably something you didn't miss. Tax reform is a big thing right now, but Paul Ryan, very careful in his language this week, said that the tax cuts will save Americans an average of $1,200 per family. Careful, because he didn't say that the average family would be saving this amount. So, it's no secret that the corporate tax reduction of around 50% is going to boost the economy, but it's not exactly going to be impacting everybody in the best way.
James,
yeah,
you
so
teased
last
yours.
thing quickly.
We're waiting all day.
The Mooch. So the Mooch is on Barstool's Pardon My Take podcast this week. Couple notable things. Mascaramucci. I don't know, would you buy Mascaramucci?
No.
Mascara by the Mooch. Sunglasses in that Instagram post of ours are women's sunglasses, but hey, the Mooch says that gender is a spectrum, so it's all good there.
And we ran out of time for mine again, but real quick, apparently there was an area man who reported to jury duty this week. Plot twist, it was former President Barack Obama.
Yeah, Graham finding new ways to mess up Chicago traffic.
Okay,
really impressive.
That's all the time we have for you tonight. If that wasn't enough of a nightcap, it's only 8:30, so you have plenty of time to keep talking.
We'll see you next week.